Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome an accomplished and respected author from San Francisco, USA, Reenita Hora. Reenita, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Ashutosh. It's a pleasure to be on the show.
Thank you. Reenita is an author, screenwriter, and a producer, and we're going to talk today about her book, Vermilion Harvest, Playtime at the Bagh. So, Renita, before we come to your book, you began
Mhm.
your career in journalism with organizations such as Bloomberg and CNN. How did
That's right.
reporting real events shape the storyteller you became?
Oh my gosh, I think reporting real events was the foundation for all things storytelling, as far as I'm concerned,
Mhm.
because every journalist knows that you've got a very limited format, whether this is print, whether this is broadcast, whether radio. I did a lot of radio.
Yeah.
You've got a limited time,
Mm.
and whether it's limited number of words or it's like a 3-minute news spot, you got to create a full story, beginning, middle, end, set
Mm.
up, progression. And that really is the essence of all good storytelling. Writing books is long form, very long form. You're looking at 60,000 words, sometimes, all the way up to 100,000 words plus sometimes. And with screenplays, you're more limited. You've got, 100 pages, thereabouts. But you've got to, follow that structure to bring that full story again, beginning,
Mm.
middle, end, act one, two, three, midpoint, cliffs, whatever it might be. So journalism really gives you that discipline. And I think for me, definitely that's where it started.
Fascinating. Fascinating. And what prompted your transition from journalism into fiction and screenwriting?
Yeah, great question. And I'm always trying to think about, the exact answer to that. Writing fiction and writing fictional stories has
Mm.
always been there in the background as
Mm.
something that I wanted to do or did on the side for a very long time before anything was published.
Mhm.
Um, and, so it was inevitable, I think, perhaps, that, one thing would lead to the next. Now, my very early books, my very first books were actually nonfiction, which were not necessarily journalistic, but, nonfiction storytelling is somewhat of a derivative, you could say, you could
Mhm.
argue. Of course, those were different. Those were DIY self-help books, my very
Mm.
early books. And I knew that what I wanted to do was write fiction. So for many, many years, I had been writing fiction, but it would just sort of sit on the back burner
Mm.
on my desk, not see the light of day, certainly wasn't published until one day I decided to change that and then fell in love with the format.
Mm.
Fiction is my happy place. But sometimes when you look at that and you say, okay, well, what really is fiction? I draw from everyday life, the material that is around me.
Yeah,
So I always say that fiction is, in fact, twisted reality.
absolutely. I love the way you put that twisted reality. Completely agree. So, Rita, let's now come to your book,
Yes.
Vermilion Harvest, Playtime at the Bagh. And I'm going to ask all our viewers and listeners to go and check out Reenita Hora's book. My first question is, what first drew you to the story of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre? And why did you feel compelled to revisit it through fiction?
So there is a very old history, attached to this. I mean, many, many years ago, I'm talking about some 35, 40 years ago, when I was in school, and I was in the 11th standard. I was in a play that was set against the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, and
Hmm.
that's what really got me into the idea of sort of what happened that day, what was happening in Amritsar politically at the time. And, our history textbooks never offered more than two paragraphs. So
Correct.
it was just not enough. I dug into this with my grandfather, who was still alive then, and he had actually experienced, he was in Amritsar when it happened and had experienced the tragedy and had walked by the Bagh a few days after it as a young boy
Mm.
and had seen this pile of slippers, this pile of chappals which left a really vivid impression upon him. These were the slippers of the dead that had been gathered to
Mm,
redistribute,
mm,
India not being a country of footwear, right?
yeah.
And these are stories that he passed down to us and really stuck with us as well, our generation, and me specifically.
Hmm.
And around that time, I actually read a love story, Eric Segal's love story. I was not
Hmm.
into romance. I said that this is not my jam. This is not what I do. But I fell in love with Eric Segal's love
Hmm.
story, an
Hmm.
epic love story, which has not a happy ending. Hence, it's not a romance. Romances have these formulas, right? Happily ever after, happy for now.
Mm, mm,
This didn't fit that. And fast forward to many years later, I
mm.
watched Titanic, the movie,
Yeah.
another epic love story, this one set against a disaster,
Mm,
ship sinking. And fast forward again to many years after that, I was writing a lot of young adult and read John Green's The Fault in Our Stars, another
mm,
beautiful love story.
mm,
And I think that's when it somehow all came together for me in some way, shape, or form that I knew what my Jallianwala Bagh story would be. It would be a
mm,
love story.
mm.
And that's what sort of got me going.
How fascinating. How fascinating. Tell me about the title. It is very striking and it's layered. How did you arrive
Very.
at your title and what does it symbolize?
So, the original title is what is currently the subtitle, Playtime at the Bog. That's what I
Hmm.
thought I would name it, and my was the working title of my manuscript for a long time.
Hmm.
Playtime at the Bog being a metaphor for General Dyer's play of bullets in the
Mm.
bog that
Yeah.
day,
Mm.
right? Um, and then it wasn't until we were sort of in the edit process and close to the end that I decided that would be the subtitle. And I really chose the name. I really wanted to choose the name Vermilion Harvest. Harvest because this happens on the day of Vaisakhi, Spring
Mm.
Harvest Festival.
Yeah.
And vermilion, layered, many, many reasons. Vermilion is the color of blood. It is the color of life.
Mm.
So when you talk about the Spring Harvest Festival and the celebration of springtime, you're
Mm.
talking about the celebration of life, and blood signifies life. However, there was blood shed in the Bagh that day,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
And vermilion, also sindhur, is what the married woman applies to her parting, right? To denote that she's a married woman. And in this case, Aruna, our protagonist, is not married per se, or at least not in the traditional sense,
Mhm.
but her very last meeting with Ayaz, before they separate, and, then she finds him in the bog that day, or goes looking for him, I should say. He applies Sindhur to her parting. So this signifies that at least in her head, they were married.
Mm.
So you're right, layered on many, many levels, and that's kind of what I like to do.
Fascinating. Fascinating. But I mean, I've been to Jallianwala Bagh many times, but
Mhm.
many readers know the facts of the massacre, but few know the atmosphere leading up to it. Why was it important for you to show the simmering unrest beforehand in your book?
Great question, because this is what we know. There was an incident. It happened that day.
Hmm.
General Dyer, how many bullets, who shot, how many people were killed or injured or whatever. This is what we know. But
Hmm.
what we don't know is everything leading up to it, how there was so much unrest
Hmm.
that any one of those events happening in the 20 odd days leading
Hmm.
up to this could have turned into something major. But, these were averted. Also, the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, it didn't just come out of nowhere. It's not like General Dyer just showed up out of town. Yes, he showed up unannounced, uninvited, but there were reasons. Punjab was in a state of dire unrest. So was the rest of India. But over here, there was a lot happening. The local Congress leaders, Dr. Saifuddin Chichlu, Dr. Satyapal, were really gathering people. So my fictional character, Ayaz, has actually come over from Lahore to
Mm,
spend time in Amritsar. He's abandoned his studies. He's a law student because the local Congress leaders are really gathering people to discuss this idea of home rule here.
mm,
Gandhiji has called for hartals across the country, and the Hall Bazaar in Amritsar was sort of a central place for the hartals to happen in this area. And
mm,
you're talking about a time when certainly there were newspapers and there were very few people had radio, but very few people.
mhm,
But still, even to get the current news, by the time a newspaper would have published it, it would have been at least a day later, or in some cases, most cases, probably a few days old,
mm,
right?
mm,
So the news actually spread through the city and through the bazaar. Now, when you think about a bazaar, any bazaar, right? Yes, it's a place of buyers and sellers where goods are traded, but it is definitely the center of the community. It's where people gather, it's where the gossip spreads, it's where the
mm,
news spreads, and
mm,
this is exactly what was happening. This
mm,
is how people were finding out politically what is happening, that curfews are being established, but everybody doesn't know about them. So it's a lot
mm,
of word of mouth activity, which led to a
mm,
lot of unrestful incidences.
mm,
And then you've got like banks burning down, the local Indians suddenly turning against white blood, suddenly turning against the British. In my fictional story, I have Aruna, the protagonist, who is actually Anglo-Indian, so half British blood. And she rides a rickshaw every day to school. And suddenly one day the rickshawwala says, I'm not taking you anymore because you're British.
mm,
She's not British, but the very fact that she has British blood running through her veins. And this is exactly what was happening in Amritsar at the time.
mm,
We don't
mm.
think about these things.
Yeah,
We don't think about, what leads to these events. And I thought that was very important to understand.
fascinating. And how did the Rowlatt Satyagraha shape the world of your protagonists?
Yes, well, the Rowlatt Satyagraha, really what it does is clamp down on your basic freedoms.
Mm-hmm,
Okay? All of a sudden, you've got, three or four people who are gathered on the corner of a street, and
mm,
that could be a meeting that is seditious.
mm,
So, according to the government, we can now arrest them. We don't need to give them any cause, we just arrest
mm,
them. So that's just one example, right?
mm, mm,
Basic freedoms are being clamped down upon. But
mm,
over here, I have an interfaith love story
mhm,
between an Anglo-Indian school teacher and a feisty Muslim activist. They already know that their relationship is in many ways doomed.
mm,
Conflict is just part of their daily life, right?
mm,
They're not going to be accepted. They're not going to have the freedom to develop their relationship, to
mm,
love each other.
mm.
I mean, you're talking about a conservative society anyway. So anyway, those, restrictions and freedoms,
Yeah.
are not there. And Ayaz strongly believes that, if we need to have the freedom to explore our love,
Mm,
then this goes hand in hand with, the freedoms that must exist around us universally. Because if there is no free India, if we do not have the freedom just to live as regular people, whatever
mm.
regular means, then how are we going to have the freedom to develop our relationship?
Correct, correct, correct.
So even though the Rowlatt Satyagraha was attacking freedom, let's say on a macro level, on a very micro level, and their relationship, it was part of that. It was part and
Mm,
parcel of that, and one had to go under the umbrella of the other.
fascinating. How important was it for you to portray women's perspectives during a period often narrated through male political figures?
Oh my gosh, incredibly important. You see, this is it. India has been through so much. Every civilization has been through so much, but
Correct.
India has been through so much. And at this particular
Absolutely.
time
Mm,
of history, but all of our narratives are male narratives. Now, I have nothing against the guys. I
absolutely.
have nothing
Mm,
against the men.
mm, mm,
But the women were very much in the room. in the
Absolutely.
city,
Mm-hmm.
in that life, in that world.
Mm-hmm.
And when we look at history, our
Mm-hmm.
history, we never ever see it through the eyes of the women, through the eyes of the minorities, right? And as a storyteller, I strongly believe that it is my mission to sort of change that,
Mm-hmm.
because even when you just talk about April 13th, there were women in the Bagh that day, there were children in the Bagh that
Yeah.
day. There were, like I said, minorities, which is the reason I have chosen an Anglo-Indian protagonist,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, and women, I know, just from being Punjabi and just from sort of growing up in a household that sort of also hails from Amritsar, they were not allowed to go out freely, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there were a lot of restrictions. There were a lot of rules, perhaps, that were broken because rules will be broken, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And but we just don't explore that side of, society at all. We never see it from the
Mm-hmm.
woman's point of view or what she has had to face.
Mm-hmm.
So it was incredibly
Yeah.
important for me to have that female perspective,
Mm. Very
like you said,
interesting.
in a very
Very
male world.
interesting. And what role did the city of Amritsar play in the novel? Because it seems to almost have a character of its own.
Absolutely. You hit the nail on the head because, it's very, very interesting how the British actually weaponized the city itself.
Mm.
You know, if you look at the geography of the city,
Mm.
and this is similar perhaps to Lahore and to some of the other cities in Punjab, you've got a religious center in a walled city. So you've got the religious center, in this case, the Golden Temple. Then you've
Yeah.
got, these bazaars that are radiating out of that, all around the city. And then you've got the city walls. The cantonment, the British cantonment is intentionally placed outside of the walls because if anything is going to happen, the British want to be able to up and leave.
Mm.
The Indians will get trapped. And what was happening, days before the massacre were these unreasonable things. So, because the British were so insecure about unrest and this political unrest,
Mm-hmm.
they were doing things like, for example, issuing curfews and issuing ridiculous times for the curfews for 2 p.m. Okay, so there was unrest. There were people, who had died because of the unrest. So funerals have to take place. Now, cremation grounds and burial grounds for the Muslims,
Mm.
cremation grounds for the Hindus and Sikhs are all outside of the walled city.
Mm-hmm.
So you know how the funerals take place. There's a procession, you have to go to the religious center first, then go to the cremation ground, etc. There is no way all of that could be done in the course of a day, even if you left quite early in the morning, in order to be able to go outside, then come back to the city gates and be back home by 2 p.m. So this is intentional. It's an intentional ploy for the British to be able to stop those funeral participants at the city gates in the Naka Bandi and use it as an excuse to arrest them.
Mm.
So you see, there are various, and this is just one example, but there are various ways in which the British are actually weaponizing the city. And
Mm.
so it's very important to portray that. It's actually a lecture that I give now as a visiting lecturer in colleges, usually that are studying Indian history or Indian sort of urban architecture and, historical architecture and so
Mm-hmm.
forth. Um, because it's very much an example of what was happening in colonial India, using this case as again as a
Mm.
micro level study, if you will.
Fascinating. Fascinating. How did you approach writing scenes connected to such a traumatic historical event with sensitivity and respect?
Oh my gosh, how do I answer that? Um, I think to bring sensitivity and certainly respect, which goes hand in hand with that, you have to bring yourself into the situation.
Mm.
Um, I don't know what the rules are of writing historical fiction or if there are rules.
Mm-hmm.
Why I say that is because if you're writing a fantasy book, you create a world, then you
Yeah.
create rules within the world,
Yeah.
so forth. Over here, historical fiction, may be fiction, but the history actually took place.
Hmm.
So to me, what I wanted to do was uh, really depict that historical place,
Hmm.
time frame, situation, and then take my fictional characters and
Hmm.
place them in that world to see how they would react, how
Hmm.
they would respond.
Hmm.
Okay. So in order to maintain that sensitivity, I
Hmm.
have to think about how is an Anglo-Indian, how is a woman, how is a Muslim in a Ram Navami festival, how is uh, a rickshawala who suddenly sees this half white-blooded woman as an antagonist going to react,
Hmm.
you know? And how does that then affect her friend,
Hmm.
Amrita, who is a Punjabi kudi, who is not white-blooded, but they have a close relationship. She's also going to abandon the rickshaw because she's not going to stand
Hmm.
for this nonsense. So
Hmm.
that sensitivity has to
Hmm.
come about when you put yourself in the shoes of those characters,
Very interesting.
right?
Hmm.
They may be fictional, but they are based on real people,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
right?
Great response. Great response. Rita, I have time for two more questions for you.
Yes.
How do international readers respond differently from Indian readers to your story?
Oh my gosh, so incredibly differently because, firstly, international readers, when they read historical fiction, most of what they've been exposed to is Western historical fiction,
Correct.
right? So you've got, Victorian era, or, in the US, certainly where I am, a lot of historical fiction set in the South. They very rarely get a chance to explore another culture, and certainly not India,
Hmm.
through the lens of historical fiction.
Hmm.
Now, most people, most of the international readers, 9 out of 10 of them, I would say, have said, we had no idea that this incident even took place. Yes, they've
Hmm.
heard of British colonialism in India, India became independent, the basic things, but they have no idea about the Jallianwala Bagh massacre,
Yeah.
nor do they know that it was actually this incident that truly sparked our independence movement.
Hmm.
So it comes as a shock, and it comes as a why is it that this has been hidden from history? And of course, it hasn't been hidden. It's just that nobody bothered,
Correct.
you know.
Correct. Correct.
And
Absolutely.
that's very different,
Uh,
obviously, to the
I agree.
Indians who are aware, but Indians are still not aware of the detail, that
Absolutely.
you
And that's a
mentioned.
very powerful message you're taking out to the world because it was a major, major event in our history.
Exactly.
Absolutely. And my last question for you, Renita. After readers close the final page of your book, Vermilion Harvest, Playtime at the Bagh, what feeling or question do you hope stays with them?
So this is a question, by the way, I always say I like to ask the readers because
Mm,
I want to know. However, having said that, as I
mm,
mentioned, earlier when we were talking about the Rowlatt Act and so forth, when you look at our basic freedoms back then, 100 plus years ago, and you think that we didn't really have many, and then you look at our situation today
mm,
and you think about it again, basic freedoms. How much have things really changed? Or did they change and have they reverted
mm,
back to, a situation or a place or, that they were a while ago? And when you think back over the last 100 plus years to the
mm,
Jallianwala Bagh massacre, politically what that meant then and politically what we are living in today, you question and you think, what have we actually learned from history?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And on that note, Rita, I just want to say what a fascinating conversation this has been with you. I've been to Jallianwala Bagh half a dozen times. First time maybe 50 years ago, the last about 5, 6 months ago. And every time I've gone back there, I've always, remembered that there's so much to learn and there's so much to be able to remember from this incredible loss of lives that happened in our country. Thank you for
So
taking me through your book. Thank you for presenting the book in such a beautiful manner through fiction, history. Thank you again, and good luck to you.
thank you so much, Ashutosh. It's been such a pleasure, and I can't thank you enough.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.